Chris, repeat after me after I say this, okay? I, Chris.
I, Chris.
Promise.
Just drop something. Promise.
That I will try.
I will try.
Not to swear.
This is I'm not doing this.
Well, on that note, let's get started.
Now, what I suggest you do is this. Have yourself seated with...
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the next episode of the Super Dharma Bros. So I'm Super Dharma Bro Kevin.
I'm Super Dharma Bro Chris.
And today our discussion is on probably, if you were making a top 10 list, this would be like number 1 or number 2 when it comes to the teachings in Buddhism is the Four Noble Truths. Do you agree, Chris?
I would happen to say, yeah, I think it's the core. I think if you're going to be like, what is all of Buddhism condensed down into, it'd be this.
Right, right.
Of course, it breaks off into 1,000 million lists from that, but this is widely and academically kind of considered to be the root of everything.
Right. So if you're going to get stuck on any of the teachings, the Four Noble Truths is a good way to go. There are a few things where you probably wouldn't want to get too stuck. Like, how does karma work? That probably isn't something that we would probably take up right away.
Well, I think it's important. And I mean, this was the first talk the Buddha gave publicly. And I've heard that there's some questions on that, which of course, anything that's an oral tradition from thousands of years ago, you're going to be a little unsure about. But yeah, if you think about it, it's basically Buddha shows up on the scene having figured things out finally, and this is the very first thing he talks about. Right. So it seems like, yes, this is our Sermon on the Mount, so to speak. Right.
Well, so let's dive right into it. So the first noble truth is the noble truth of dukkha. Now, there are a lot of different interpretations of it, but if you wanted to just get right to the meat of the substance, or the substance of the meat, it would be that this is the noble truth of dukkha. So, Chris, I leave dukkha untranslated because I find that there's no adequate English equivalent, but you have a different viewpoint on that.
Right. So this is, if you're reading this in almost any textbook, early book on Buddhism, and even most modern books on Buddhism in the West, you'll hear this translated as the truth of suffering. There is suffering, sometimes with a big S.
Right. And I think that can lead to some people underestimating some things that we don't see as suffering, quote unquote. So boredom is a type of suffering. Anyone who gets bored a lot would know that. But if you're just in a general state of boredom, you're like, yeah, I'm just bored. I'm not suffering or anything. But it is a subtle form of suffering. And it's the same thing with a neutral feeling. It is a form of dukkha. But anyway, in this first discourse, which you can find in Samyutta Nikaya, it's 5611, and you can find a more detailed explanation in the Majjhima Nikaya, which is middle-length discourses in 141. But here are the things that are, this is the list of things that are dukkha. Birth is dukkha, aging is dukkha, death is dukkha, sorrow, lamentation, pain, distress, despair, not giving what one wants, being separated from what we like, and being united with things that we don't like. And lastly, in short, the 5 clinging aggregates are dukkha. And that's a really long list. And, I have the Sutta references here, so I'm going to put the Sutta references into the description for the YouTube. And people can look at, how it's defined in the Suttas. Because if we talked about all these points together, this would be an hour-long episode, and I'm not interested in doing an hour-long episode on this because I actually went through a talk that was an hour long on this topic, and it was tough to get through, even for someone who knows things like myself. Now, Chris, this has probably happened with you before, but I was at a gathering during this whole COVID crisis, which probably wasn't a good idea, but we were being safe about it.
Right.
And someone said, oh yeah, I was hanging out with some Buddhists and they said life is suffering. And I cringed inwardly very hard. And I said, that's not what the noble truth of dukkha is.
Right.
And the reason why that bothers me so much is, one, it doesn't say it in the sutta.
Right.
But two, also that there are misconceptions about, that phrase, life is suffering.
Yeah, and so I think the way I interpret it, like the way I would reword it if I got to be in charge of these things, which rightfully I'm not, would be that, like, no one's free from the human condition. You can, like, there are parts of life that give you joy, but then also there's the reality that all those things that give us joy are bound at some point to change, and we don't like change naturally. So the coffee one's a perfect example. Last night, driving home from also a social distance party where we sat in a field like 20 feet from each other and yelled about philosophy. Driving back from that party, I realized I was thinking about today and what I was going to do to get ready, and I thought, oh my God, I'm out of coffee. And like, suffering, like with coffee, definitely suffering, but just kind of unhappiness, and it's that even the good things, if you pay attention, you'll find they kind of change. Before this, when I was getting my notes together, I have like a little meditation garden out in my yard, and I was sitting there and it was really nice, and I was reading my notes and I was like, oh, this is so nice, the prayer flags fluttering, and then a spider jumped on my face. It's that anything can kind of move like that, and it's wherever the external and our internal interact, at some point it can kind of change to just not be fully satisfactory. I don't know. What do you think, Kevin?
Yeah, so whenever I talk about dukkha, I talk about the overall feeling of unsatisfactoriness, even in the things that we truly enjoy, because those things are transitory, they're temporary. And, joy, pleasure, which often gets confused with happiness, those things are transitory and they change, even moment to moment, that's changing. I also think unsatisfactoriness is sort of puts it into a different perspective than suffering does, because suffering's like, oh, some people will be like, oh, woe is me, I'm suffering.
Right.
As opposed to, this is a really unsatisfactory experience. How can we improve upon that? So,
yeah.
And, some people, and this even happened to monks, where the Buddha said, well, meditate on the nature of the body. And that caused those monks so much dukkha, they committed suicide.
Yeah, I mean, now I will say, so to be clear, like when we're doing this, Kevin's probably going to say dukkha. I'm probably going to say suffering. We mean the same thing. Just from a vocab perspective, it's very confusing. But that being said, one thing I do kind of appreciate about the almost pessimistic version of the read, in a way, is that it points to problems we all have, which I think in our culture, and especially in a lot of parts of modern culture, we have a hard time doing. Especially in the kind of like Eastern spheres that show up in America, the kind of like woo-woo, crystals and light, blah, 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 BS. There's a lot of like spiritual bypassing where it's like everything's fine all the time. It's great. And I think when you hear someone like the Buddha just say very pointedly, like, your life hurts. That's just true. And that kind for me, and I know for a lot of people, Sharon Salzberg talks about this, and I'll link a talk she has on this in our thing. But for me, that was the thing that made me feel okay. That was the thing that made me drawn to Buddhism, when the Buddha says, your life's not okay. And I was like, it's not. And I was like, cool. So what do I do with that? And that's everything after that. But so I think there can be some good to that. But you're right. If you sit around going, all of life is suffering, no one gets on board with that. Everyone is just going to be depressed all the time.
Right. And one of the beautiful things about dukkha, if you want to say it's a beautiful thing, is that it doesn't matter if you're rich, poor, somewhere in between, white, black, purple, green, everyone experiences it. And so it's something that we all have a common link to. And I think, if we looked at life from that perspective, we wouldn't have as much division as we have now.
Yeah.
The noble truth of dukkha. Hold on, let me make sure that I get this right with the wording. I wouldn't want to have a teacher actually call me out on something.
They should call us out on a lot.
Well,
of things,
yeah,
buddy.
well, the noble truth of dukkha, so like Chris said, same thing, is to be comprehended and has been comprehended. So that's when we fully realize that first noble truth. That's called the three spokes of the truth. But let's move to the second truth, which is the noble truth of the origin of dukkha, which is craving. But you can't really have that without clinging to it as well, or attachment. So that's the second noble truth. And most of the time when we're clinging to something, it's because it brings some sort of delight or pleasure to us. Or it can go on the other side where it's like we're clinging to something because we don't want what we have. So it's like, I've always said that I wanted to be more like I was in college, more open-minded, more learned, more, booky type thing instead of video gamey. And I don't know, sometimes I think I'm like, why am I clinging to that standard? Because I'm not that person anymore. Life has, after college, has changed everything. So why am I clinging to that? But anyway, sort of having that craving now and then clinging to that, sort of, that basically gets right to the bare knuckles of why is there dukkha? And that's sort of like the beginning points. Look at where that craving is.
Yeah, I mean, to me, it kind of feels like the way I always dumb it down is we want something and then the world is not that way. And at some point in our interaction with the thing, we finally realize the world is not that way. And then that is the dukkha, Because, again, you can enjoy the video game. You can enjoy the coffee. You can enjoy those things. But at some point, the disconnect happens. And, I think, that basically there is a cause, and the cause of the suffering is the disconnection. And the cause of the disconnection is the craving, the desire for the thing.
Right. And the Sutta, Majjhima Nikaya 141, describes three kinds of cravings, basically. Craving for sensual pleasures, that's pretty self-explanatory. We all have senses. We want things that make our senses feel good.
Yeah.
Craving for being, so being wealthier or, being healthier, that type of situation. And craving for non-being, so not being lazy and playing video games all day, that type of situation. And so you might think, some of those aren't necessarily terrible. And I would argue, yes, that some of those things are not necessarily terrible. But if you're clinging on to that and it's causing you duress, that's something that we need to look at closely in our practice. Do you agree, Chris?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's okay to want to be better at things. I think it's not that we have to just sit around and be like these neutral blobs, Mm-hmm. I'm not, and I think maybe you talked about this later. I don't know. I'm not one of those don't even desire being desireless kind of Buddhists, people who get caught up in that. But I just think overall that, when we start wanting a thing to be a certain way, and when we want to be a certain way, and we start creating a narrative about who we are going to be, I think we need to be mindful of that and be aware of, okay, what happens when this goes wrong?
And also, not only being mindful enough to realize when it's causing us stress, mm-hmm. but also being heedful which means taking that information and doing something about it, basically. And being able to say, well, I need to let that go. You know, you see that phrase sometimes, let it go.
Yeah.
Or, you know, in popular songs we have, you know, things about letting it go.
Yeah.
But we need to look at even that from a different perspective, because we think letting go, it's like, I don't want it, you throw it away or something.
Right.
And that's not necessarily what we're talking about here. And hold on, let me get his name. So Ajahn Sumedho, he describes it more as like putting it down as opposed to throwing it away. So I don't need this. I'm just going to put it down somewhere.
Right.
And, you know, it will still be there, but I don't need it.
Right.
So we can do that with our own dukkha if we're mindful of it, and then we do something with it. And sometimes you'll see in translations, laying down the burden is what an arahat does. So the most enlightened being just lays the burden down. They're not throwing it away. They're just putting it down.
Right.
So I think when we get that phrase, you know, letting it go and all of that, we need to look at that from that perspective as opposed to, I don't want it, throw it away in the garbage.
Yeah, there are really good subtle ways of reinterpreting so many concepts we have in Buddhism, where we have a normal translation or phrase or definition, and then when you think about it, in our own language that carries baggage, like you're saying, yeah, like let it go, like throw it away. No, just first off, admit you're holding it. Because that's a thing we don't even do. We don't even admit we're holding on to the thing. And then once we realize we're holding on to the thing, we can go, okay, you know, do I want to carry this weight? You know, and then you can set it down.
Right. And so just to finish off, there are 3 spokes to this noble truth as well. There are 3 spokes for all of them, just because, you know, uniformity is awesome. So the noble truth of the origin of dukkha is to be abandoned or eradicated. It depends on who you're reading. And has been abandoned or eradicated. But we're not going to worry about those 2 because we're just worried about getting it out there. And so that's all I wanted to cover for the first 2 truths. So Chris, you take the next 1.5 truths, because we're not fully analyzing the 4th one today. So
yeah,
what is that 3rd truth?
Yeah. So, you know, so the 3rd truth, just to get the title slide out there, the cessation of dukkha, that dukkha can go away. So I'd argue that with the first 2 truths, we're not exactly finding anything too particularly new as far as the human experience goes. Almost all religions, cultures, societies, philosophies recognize that things aren't great. We have the human condition, whatever you want to call that. But basically, I don't think anyone's just sat around born from day one going, this is great all the time. No, we kind of all have recognized that there are problems and that we suffer. This is like a metric I often use, is that if it's been used in epic poetry as a concept to struggle with, it's probably something we all struggle with: death, aging, illness, loss, love. If you read the Iliad and it's all there, we've all been through it. And what's amazing is we've all been through it through all of time. It didn't matter if you were in 2500 BC or if you're born now, it's the same problems in a way. Everything around the problems has changed, but the problems remain the same. Where it gets really new is with the 3rd truth, which is that the suffering can go away. The dukkha can go away. There can be a cessation of it. And I'd argue that for us, and this goes back to the first talk we had, discussion we had, this is the faith bit in Buddhism, I think. We can't, sitting here as humans, we can't prove this right now necessarily. And when I have these conversations with folks, when I start laying out the 4 noble truths, they're like, first it was like, yeah, okay, cool. And then I'm like, and now you don't have to suffer. And they're like, you're gonna have to suffer. Like you can't get away from the suffering. No, that's what Buddhism's saying, is that you don't have to be this way. You can have the human condition, but the human condition doesn't have to weigh heavily upon you as you experience it. You're not going to get rid of it necessarily, and there's debate on this, but you're going to experience those hurtful things They're just not going to like destroy you or ruin you or be a burden you carry.
Right. And there's also, some people have written that, the Four Noble Truths is sort of like a formula for the way we treat disease. And I know you have some reservations about that as for some interpretations, but, like the first Noble Truth is like the symptoms
Right.
that are readily apparent. And then sort of the second Noble Truth is sort of like, well, we know the origin, so we have a diagnosis because we know what the origin is. And then the third is sort of like the prognosis of we don't need this anymore. We got a treatment for that. And then the fourth is sort of like the treatment. And
right.
I'm going to let you get to that instead of keep talking.
So, but yeah, no, you got it. So the prognosis with Buddhism, and the unique prognosis, is that it doesn't have to be this way. And that, let's go to number 4. So the way to the cessation of dukkha, the way out of suffering, that's the fourth one. So again, the prognosis, we have our prognosis, and the prognosis says, hey, things aren't great, but they can be better. Now, I think I was thinking about, and I really never thought about until we started writing these notes. We kept, like Kevin pointed out, we do the thing where it's like, there's the, here are the symptoms, here's the causes of the symptoms, here's your prognosis, here's the medicine. The medicine is considered the Dharma, the teachings, all the practices that we do as Buddhists to alleviate all those things. I was thinking about it. Medicine kind of implies like someone hands you a thing and you stick it under your tongue and it's better. Which I would argue that you kind of see that way of thinking in other religions sometimes. The concept of salvation. It's like, the basic issue with being a human is things are bad, you kind of suck. What do you do about it? And some religions go, things are bad, you kind of suck, there's nothing you can do about it. Salvation, if I give you salvation and you're saved, though, you don't have to do anything about it. Take the medicine. Other people, kind of like nihilists, might argue, things suck, you suck, there's nothing you can do about it, just be okay with it, which is, yeah, your leg hurts, just get used to your leg hurting. Buddhism says, things suck, you suck, here is a regimen of things you can do to fix the problem. So the Buddha says other people take medicine, they just pop a pill and they say, I'm better. And that's just going to cover the symptoms. What you need to do, you need to change your diet, you need to exercise, you need to go to physical therapy, you need to go to therapy. There's a lot of different things you have to do to work on this. So for us, that regimen that is in the way of the cessation of dukkha is the Eightfold Path. So, and this is the thing we're not going to really get into today because, well, one, I'm going to argue basically the number 4, cessation of dukkha, is basically, and here's Buddhism. So we could talk about this for, I don't know, how many thousands of years has Buddhism been around? We could talk that long. And the Eightfold Path is basically a condensed form of this, I would argue. And that everything kind of splinters off different aspects of this. Like you could basically draw a line back to some part on the Eightfold Path from any idea we talk about from here on out. Or anything you ever read from here on out. And of course the dog starts barking now. Suffering. So I like to, when I think about the Eightfold Path, because I can't think about just 8 things. I can't remember 8 things. I like to break it down into like 3 stages. And I've heard it broken down different ways. This is the one I like. I'm just going to kind of read over this real quick. So the first stage of the Eightfold Path is ethics, which I would kind of summarize as our interaction with other living beings. And ethics isn't always the sexiest one in Buddhism, but I actually really like this because I think this is an understated part of Buddhism. But so first we have right speech. And to be clear, before I go down this rabbit hole, there are tons of different interpretations and debates on this. So the right speech one, right speech, harming no one with our words. There's a lot around that, lying, swearing, like we were just talking about this when we logged in. Kevin doesn't swear, I swear. There's all these different things. But so we would say that you have to be mindful of your speech and that you can't hurt others with your speech. Right action. We can't harm anyone with our bodies and with our choices. And then right livelihood, and I think this is a super interesting one. I don't know if a lot of religions break this down, that in providing and caring for ourselves, we cannot hurt others or our communities. You know, even, and then there's, oh my gosh, this is what I want to talk about. But so that's the three ethics. So right speech, right action, right livelihood. Our mental discipline is the second stage, our interaction with our own practice, our interaction with trying to go through these causes of dukkha and kind of eradicating them or working with them. So right effort, working to celebrate and foster what heals us and to identify and work with what harms us. So Buddhism is not all about like just get rid of the bad things. And it's not about like stoically don't recognize the good things you do. We celebrate the good we do. We recognize the bad we do. We celebrate the things we've realized and figured out. And then we also recognize, well, here's the work I have to do. That's our effort that we're putting into that. Right? Mindfulness, being aware of what arises within our body and mind. This is one of the things we do in meditation. This is one of the things we need to do all the time. Buddhism argues that if there's something deep in your brain that's clanging around, if you're not aware of it, it's still going to impact you unconsciously, subconsciously, consciously, whatever level. So we need to be mindful of what we are doing, what's happening in us, what's arising in us. Right concentration is the sixth step on the path, focusing our meditative energies on advancing towards equanimity. So there's a lot of things that happen when we meditate. There's a lot of cool feelings and bliss and tinglies and, pick a thing. And oftentimes, I think we view those as like, oh, okay, cool. This is like kind of like you can calibrate where you're at and how things are going. I think a lot of people mistake those experiences as the final part of meditation, the goal of meditation. That's kind of the thing I often heard talk about, like the woo-woo crystal spheres. It's like, oh, when I meditate, I feel light and blah, blah, blah. And we go, okay, yeah, that's really cool. But how is this relating back to the suffering thing? How is this relating back to finding equanimity, peace, long-lastingness in yourself? So that's our concentration. The final third thing is wisdom, which is our understanding of the world. So the first two kind of relate to, other beings. The second one relates to how we interact with ourselves. The third one interacts with how we look at all phenomena, everything that occurs around us. So right thought, step 7, maintaining attitudes of compassion towards all others. Maintaining, just making sure that our thinking is not being harmful. Our thinking is not that we're not creating harmful and false narratives about things around us. Right understanding, which is the final one, comprehending and experiencing the truth of how things are, namely the Four Noble Truths.
Yep.
Yeah, it just it gets to the bottom and says, see step 1. But, this is understanding impermanence. This is understanding concepts around the self and absence of the self. It's understanding cause and effect. It's basically saying these are things you have to wrangle with how the universe works. And if you don't actually recognize that these things are real, if you don't recognize how these things show up in your life, you're not going to be able to do any of these other things. The narrative you create for yourself will always be wrong. It'll always be a little off. It will always lead you to more suffering. So I think it's by living our lives in this way, structured around this, and by being vigilant with how we interact with the world. In this final step, the Buddha is saying that we can now see how patterns arise. We begin to see where we fail to connect, where we fail to grow. We start to see the cycles and the habits and the clinging, and slowly we learn to work with this. We learn to feel less bewildered by what arises in us. You know, when a new thing arises, we're not like, what is that? We just go, oh, look at that. Look at that homicidal feeling. Oh, look at that sadness. Look at this hunger. Look at this whatever. You know, nothing surprises us anymore. We just get to sit and gently be with ourselves or our lack of selves, but we get to sit and be with whatever is happening in us. And we begin to understand our relationship to the world around us, and we understand our relationship to the world within us. And slowly, in this life, we become free. And that is the unique promise of steps 3 and 4. You know? Kevin, what do you think?
I think that sums everything up pretty well.
Because, again, for me, the recognition of suffering, and I mean like the deep woe is me, rip my shirt kind of suffering, when I heard that this was a part of like what Buddhism was addressing, I finally felt, I don't know, I felt like at home. I felt happy. But that's not everyone's experience, and I need to be mindful of that.
I just wanted to end with a couple of final thoughts. So the first thing I wanted to point out was realizing the Four Noble Truths and, you know, interconnectedly the Noble Eightfold Path, which we're going to talk about next time, is so important that one of the Suttas says you should be stabbed by a spear 100 times in the morning, 100 times at midday, and 100 times in the evening so that's 300 times each day for 100 years. And if at the end of that you realize the Four Noble Truths, you got yourself a good deal. And the logic being, because once you realize all that, there's no rebirth or anything. You're completely free, basically.
Well, and I think that's actually, while that is a crazy metaphor, I think it's kind of a beautiful one, because if in your own life you have suffered, and if in your own life you've hurt, you've struggled with depression, addiction, with wanting, with not wanting, with pick a thing. If you've struggled, and if at the end of that struggle, you've learned something about yourself, others, the way things work, if you've learned how to get out of that struggle, the struggle was beautiful and worth it. Those spear stabs were worth every single stab. You know, that is the kind of beautiful universality of suffering. That's, if you look at a lot of practices we do, like even in the Tibetan tradition, like Tonglen meditation, giving and taking of pain and suffering, like all these beautiful traditions where it's like, I want to give like healing to this person. We start out by contemplating our own suffering and the suffering of the world, and how this is the thing that unites us. We are all stuck in the same bad prison of just the human condition. And so, yeah, if you go through that pain and you learn something from it, the pain was the best teacher you've ever had. Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, who, again, controversial teacher, I think he said that just like completely broke through all my walls, was the thing that destroys you is your best teacher. But one thought. When I talk, I often use the phrase, you know, in this lifetime you can achieve blah, blah, blah. That is the unique promise of Buddhism. And that is the unique promise of Buddhism, I would argue. I would like to say it doesn't always feel like it's working. It doesn't all, it's in this lifetime, but it's not this afternoon. You know, so this is, again, wherever the faith bit comes in, there's going to be times where you're trying these things where it's not going to feel easy. It's not going to feel right to yourself. Like our tendencies for craving, for desire, our want for those things can often supersede our knowledge that maybe this thing we're doing hurts us. Any addict or person like that can tell you that what's good for you and what your body's telling you to do aren't always the same. So we shouldn't be ignoring ourselves, and we shouldn't be depriving ourselves of things. But at the same time, be aware that this is not like a thing that you just are like, oh, I should give up craving. That'll work. Like, you're going to have to work at this. But just start by being mindful of where it shows up, you know? I did have words. I knew it.
Okay. All right, so that concludes our 3.5 Truths talk. So our next talk is going to be on the path to the cessation of dukkha. And it's going to be far more in-depth than what Chris had, because there is the Theravada side of it, and
Right.
I'll have a whole bunch of references for you in that one.
There will be so many lists.
But don't worry. I've already, sort of like went through it, and I'm like, okay, in layperson's terms, what does that mean for our practice? So it's not going to be heavy duty. Well, we are at the monistic stage. No, we're not. We're lay people. We don't necessarily like right livelihood. It's not the same from a monistic to a layperson. A layperson has to make a living,
Right.
and feed their families and all that. So the expectations are different there than it would be for a monistic. Still, try to limit the amount of dukkha you give to others. But at the same time, got to make those dollar bills, yo.
Well, I look forward to vaguely oversimplifying things badly, so this will be fun.
Sounds great. All right, so thank you for everyone that was watching us on YouTube or listening to us on our podcast. I say sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. Well said for everything that we said today. So this is Super Dharma Bro Kevin.
This is Super Dharma Bro Chris.
Peace out, everyone.
Bye, y'all.
Have yourself seated with your backs as straight as possible, but not stiff. And now see how you feel. Don't put words on it. Just feel. But if you can't help words running in your head, don't interfere with them.